A quiet house meant one thing. In Victorian Britain, death was not just a tragedy, it was a reckoning. If someone died, a man in black would come to the door, calmly, politely, inevitably. He didn't ask if you were ready. He already knew how much it would cost. Because even in grief, there were parcels, contracts, discounts on coffins. And if the family was poor, death became even more expensive. The smell of wax, the damp air, the dark forest, and people who made money from the moment you were at your weakest. Because in a world where thousands were buried every week, grief had become a business. And the question wasn't simply who died, but much scarier, who will pay? This is not a horror story. This is history. When death became a service. Death in Victorian Britain was not a rare occurrence. It was commonplace. Almost commonplace. Cities grew faster than sewers. Hospitals were overcrowded. Diseases came without warning. And in houses where life had been ablaze yesterday, mirrors were hung today. Because death demanded ritual, and ritual demanded money. Imagine an early morning in London in the 1880s. The air is damp. The street noise is muffled by fog. Somewhere in the distance, a cart rumbles. There is silence in the small apartment above the shop. An incorrect silence, the kind in which there is no longer any breathing. The first to notice this were not the doctors, and not the priests, but the undertakers. They knew the city differently, not by the names of the streets, but by the mortality of the districts, where children died more often, where typhus was rampant, where old age came too early. Death for them was not an abstraction, it was a work schedule. The undertaker in a black coat did not look like a villain. On the contrary, he was the personification of order in the midst of chaos. A polite voice, slow movements, a reserved look, a man who came when others did not dare. But behind this politeness was a simple truth. Every death meant profit. The Victorian era created a strange paradox, a society obsessed with morality, decency, appearance, and at the same time, a society where death had become an industry. A funeral was no longer just a church ceremony. It became a show of status. The size of the coffin, the quality of the wood, the number of horses in the procession, even the depth of the mourning black. Everything mattered. And if the family was poor, they had to borrow money to look dignified before death, because shame in the Victorian world could be more terrible than debt. The smell in funeral homes was special. Wax, polished wood, fabrics, and a faint chill. Here death became neat, controlled, sold in options. Standard package, dignified package, respectable. Even grief had a price tag, and it was here that a new anxiety was born. Not, will the patient survive, but, can we bury him? Because in Victorian Britain there was a cruel detail. Death without money is the problem of the living. If the bill is not paid, the body could remain in the house longer than one would like to remember. The neighbors began to whisper. The smell became heavier. Time became unbearable. And the undertaker, who only yesterday had been the personification of help, turned into a reminder of debt. They spoke softly, always softly, because selling in grief is an art. We will take care of everything. You don't have to decide anything now. It's a worthy choice. But behind the words was arithmetic. The coffin, the hearse, the burial cloth, candles. Each element added weight to the count, sometimes imperceptibly to the family. Because in a state of shock, people rarely count. Victorian death was slow. And not just physically. The body was kept at home. Days, sometimes a week. Mirrors were closed. Clocks were stopped. Curtains were drawn. The house became a space of waiting between life and burial. And all the while, they were there. Undertakers. People who didn't just accompany death. They structured it, regulated it, monetized it. But were they just cynics? This is where the story gets complicated. Because in a world where death was everywhere, someone had to take care of its logistics. Someone had to transport the bodies, prepare them, bury them. And the undertakers did indeed do the necessary work. But the problem was different. Where is the line drawn between service and profit? Between help and exploitation of weakness? Because when death becomes a business, grief becomes a market. And in this market, there were rules. Strict, ruthless. Families who could not pay were sometimes forced to choose the cheapest options. Or humiliating, common graves, minimal ceremonies. A quick farewell. Status haunted a person even after death, and the undertakers knew it. They saw the difference between rich and poor, not in life, but in the funeral. Luxury versus the bare minimum. Marble against raw earth. And somewhere in this system, a quiet, almost invisible anxiety arose. Death could destroy the family financially. Not illness, not war, but the funeral bill. And this is where the real danger of this story begins. Because when death is being profited from, there is a temptation. Not to wait for it, but to need it. The price of a worthy farewell. In the Victorian world, a funeral was not an end. It was a statement. A statement of status, of respect, of who a person was, or who their family wanted them to be remembered as. Death became a stage, and the undertakers became the directors. Imagine a funeral procession. The slow movement of a black hearse, horses with heavy plumes, varnished wood shining in the mist. Curtains in the houses barely open, the views from the windows. The city is watching, always watching. Because in Victorian Britain, even death was public, and every detail mattered. How many horses? What fabric? What coffin? Even the length of the mourning ribbon. The problem was this: it was expensive, very expensive. For working-class families, death often meant financial disaster. A week's pay might not cover even a basic funeral. But there was something that sounded almost like salvation. Funeral packages. The undertakers offered options, neatly worded, almost sympathetic. A modest ceremony, a dignified ceremony, a dignified ceremony. The words sounded soft, but there was a difference in debt between them. Because a dignified funeral could mean months of payments. And the families agreed. Not because they could, but because they couldn't afford the shame. Because in Victorian culture, poverty was already a disgrace, and a cheap funeral was doubly so. The undertaker knew how to speak at such times. He never pressed directly. That would be rude. He created an atmosphere of inevitability. Your mother deserves respect. People will remember. This is the last gesture of love. And in the room where the body still stood, those words sounded like a sentence. Because how could you say no? How could you choose cheapness when the one you loved was lying next to you? This was where grief became vulnerability, and vulnerability became opportunity. The smell in the house changed every day. Wax, flowers, damp cloth, and something heavier.
Time worked against the living, and the undertakers knew it.
The longer the body remained in the house, the greater the psychological tension became. You had to decide, quickly. And decisions almost always meant expenses, even in the smallest things. Candles, the tablecloth, the carriage. Every detail added to the bill. Sometimes the family didn't even realize how quickly the sums were rising, because everything was presented as a necessity. That's the way it's done. That's what everyone does. That's right. Victorian society was obsessed with correctness, even in death. And if money ran out, compromises began. Cheaper wood, fewer horses, a simpler ceremony. And every compromise hurt, because it seemed like you were betraying your memory. The undertaker never said it out loud, but sometimes a glance was enough, barely noticeable, and the family agreed to pay more. Thus was born the debt of death, a debt that the living paid off for years. Sometimes, after the funeral, the house became quieter, not only because of the loss, but because of the bills, because death was already gone, and the payments remained. But there was an even darker side to the system, something that was rarely talked about openly, because if the family couldn't pay, they became a problem for the undertaker. And here the rules of the game changed, because compassion has limits, and business doesn't. The man who waited for death. In a city where death was commonplace, where bells rang every day, where black ribbons became part of the landscape, there were people who began to look at it differently, not as a tragedy, but as an expectation. Undertakers lived in a special rhythm. They didn't just react to death, they anticipated it. Areas with epidemics, homes with elderly residents, streets where infant mortality was higher. It sounds almost unthinkable, but death had a geography, and the professionals knew it. Imagine an undertaker at the end of the week, a dark office, accounting books, neat records, names, addresses, dates, and between the lines, dry arithmetic, coffin, carriage, services, death as statistics. At first, it was simply part of the craft, like a doctor, illnesses, like a pharmacist, prescriptions. But gradually, another deformation arose. When you see death every day, it ceases to be an event. It becomes a stream. And in this stream, a dangerous thought appears. The next client is a matter of time. The undertaker did not want death. Of course not. But he knew it is inevitable, and sometimes close, especially in poor neighborhoods, where illness lingered longer, where children weakened faster, where old age came without a pension. Death there was almost a neighbor, and the undertakers became her regular guests. They came to the same houses again and again. First, the father. A month later, the child. Later, the mother. Families slowly disappeared, and the ledgers grew thicker. Over time, a cold professional instinct emerged, to notice the signs: choking, severe coughing, exhaustion. The undertaker heard these words and understood more than he said, because every illness could mean a future challenge. And this is where the moral rift was born. Because when your income depends on death, you begin to live in its shadow differently, without joy, but also without shock, with habituation. And habituation is a dangerous thing.
It erases boundaries.
Imagine the conversation. The family, in a semi-dark room. The body is still nearby. The undertaker stands calmly and says in a low voice, "Has he been ill for a long time?" The question sounds sympathetic, but it has another meaning. Was it an unexpected death or an expected one? Because unexpected death meant the family was willing to pay. Unexpected meant chaos. And chaos in business meant risk. Over time, undertakers learned to read not only illnesses, but people. Who would pay without bargaining? Who would ask for less? Who was already in debt? Grief had an expression on their faces, and the undertakers recognized it. That didn't make them monsters. That made them part of a system where death and money were too closely linked. But sometimes stories would emerge that made even them feel the cold. Because not all deaths were convenient, not all were natural, and not all were safe for those who profited from them. The room where death became neat. Before a funeral, there was a moment rarely spoken of out loud. The moment between death and farewell. The room, silent, closed, almost sacred. It was here that the body was transformed into a memory. The Victorian era feared one thing in particular: the indecency of death. Death was supposed to appear calm, not painful, not chaotic, not real. And undertakers became masters of this illusion. Imagine a funeral home: thick curtains, muted lights, the smell of wax and chemicals, and a table, cold, still, unforgiving. Here began the work that no one saw, but everyone expected its result. The body was washed, carefully, methodically, without haste. Traces of illness were hidden. The skin was tinted. The eyes were closed. The facial features were softened, because the dead were supposed to look as if they were simply sleeping. Victorian culture created a strange standard: a beautiful death, a calm face, absence of suffering, almost beauty, even if the reality was different, even if the death was difficult, even if the last minutes were terrible. The undertaker knew. The family does not want to see the truth. They want to see a farewell. And so the truth was edited. This craft required cold precision. Hands did not tremble. The faces didn't react, because emotion would interfere with the work. But this is where another quiet tension arose. Because when you touch the dead every day, the line between the living and the dead begins to blur. Skin temperature, body weight, immobility, all this became familiar, too familiar. Some offices had a practice that sounds alarming today. The body was displayed at home for several days, in the living room, among the candles, under the gaze of guests. It was called the last farewell. But there was another truth behind this. More days, more expenses, equipment rental, decorations, candles. Death continued the count even after the heart stopped. Sometimes the body began to change faster than expected. And then the work of an undertaker became a race against time. They hid smells, they closed windows, they dimmed the lights, because Victorian death was supposed to be controlled. But death did not always agree with the schedule. And it was here that moments appeared that frightened even professionals. A barely noticeable movement of the eyelids, a dubious sound. Holding breath? Or a game of nerves? In the 19th century, the fear of premature burial was real. People were afraid of waking up in a coffin, and this fear was not a fantasy, because medicine was still often wrong, and undertakers worked with what was declared dead, sometimes too soon. And in this quiet room, where death became neat, there lived one of the darkest anxieties of the age. What if he wasn't quite dead? The fear that lies in the coffin. In Victorian Britain, there was a fear, quiet, almost obsessive, that haunted people more than death itself. The fear of waking up after it. Premature burial. Words that sounded like the plot of a Gothic novel, but were part of the reality of the 19th century. Medicine was not yet precise. No breathing, weak pulse, a deep coma. All of this could look like death, sometimes convincingly, too convincingly. The newspapers of that time would occasionally print stories that chilled the blood of their readers, about coffins opened too late, about scratches on the inside of the lid, about bodies found in unnatural positions. Society listened to these stories with horror, and this horror grew. Because if death could make mistakes, then the coffin became a trap. Imagine a dark bedroom. The candles were almost burned out. The body lies motionless. The family is silent. The doctor has left. The verdict has been given. Dead. And now the undertaker appears in the room. Calm, collected, professional. He has no doubts, because his work begins where someone else's ends. The body is prepared. Hands are folded. Eyes are closed. Faces are calmed. But somewhere in the depths of the family's consciousness lives the thought, what if not? What if he simply hasn't woken up yet? This fear was so widespread that it became part of the culture. People invented safe coffins, with bells, with air tubes, with alarm mechanisms. Absurd? Maybe. But absurdity is born where there is real anxiety. And undertakers found themselves in a strange position. On the one hand, they depended on the fact of death. On the other, they worked in a world where that fact was a matter of doubt, because every mistake could become a scandal. And scandal in the business of death is a dangerous thing. Sometimes relatives insisted, wait, another day, another night, as if time could guarantee finality. But time cost money, and here again the economy of death appeared. Additional storage, additional procedures, additional expenses. Even fear was paid for. Imagine the moment the coffin was closed, the lid slowly lowered, the light disappeared. The face became visible for the last time. And it was at that moment that the fear became almost physical. Because this was the point of no return. Because after that, there was only the earth. And if the doctor made a mistake, there was nothing left to fix. This horror gave rise to a collective paranoia. People listened to the bodies. They looked for signs of warmth. They were afraid of silence. And the undertakers? They had to look absolutely sure. Because the doubt of the undertaker was more frightening than the doubt of the family. But sometimes, even they felt a chill down their spine. When death behaved strangely. Debt that lived. After the funeral, the house grew quieter. The candles were extinguished. The guests dispersed. The black clothes slowly returned to the closets. But there was one thing that did not disappear with the ceremony: the bill. In Victorian Britain, death rarely ended a story. It opened a new one. The name of the deceased was crossed out of the books of life, but the expenses were entered into the books of debt. For funerals were often paid for not with money, but with promises, in installments, gradually, when you can. The word sounded almost humane, but debt had its own nature. It did not sympathize. For working-class families, a funeral meant months, sometimes years of payments. For the coffin, for the carriage, for the ceremony that lasted several hours. Death lasted longer in the financial documents than in the memory of the city. Imagine a widow, a small room, a cold morning, a letter on the table. Neat, official, a reminder to pay. Her husband is already in the ground, but the bill is not. And now grief is combined with another fear, the fear of delay. Because the undertakers were patient, but not endlessly. First, polite letters, then visits. The man in black is on the doorstep again, now without sympathy. "We understand your situation," a phrase that was almost always followed by, "but payment is required." Sometimes families sold things, watches, furniture, clothes, to pay for death. The Victorian paradox was cruel. A person could die poor, and their funeral would create even greater poverty for the living, especially if the family sought dignity, because status even after death required spending. Sometimes debts accumulated so much that death was the beginning of a downfall. Eviction, loss of job, poverty. The funeral became an economic trap, and the undertakers knew it. They saw how, after a beautiful ceremony, the family slowly slid into financial darkness. But there was an even darker side, because not everyone could pay at all. And when the debt became hopeless, the system changed its tune, because the business of death did not like losses. And here the question arose, which sounded cold and practical: what to do with those who would not pay? Cheap funeral, expensive shame. When money was scarce, the choice became cruel. Not between good and bad, but between humiliation and debt. In Victorian Britain, there was an option called, almost neutrally, a pauper's funeral. But behind these words lay another reality: a minimal coffin, no decorations, no procession, sometimes no name. Imagine a mourning without ceremony. No horses, no black procession, no crowd, just a simple carriage, fast, quiet, no ceremony. Because a cheap funeral did not hold up the city. It did not have to create a scene. Mass graves became the final destination for thousands. No monument, no marble, no trace, only earth. And the families knew it. They feared not only death, they feared this kind of farewell. Because in Victorian society, even death was subject to social evaluation. The neighbors watched, always watched. Who came to the funeral? What coffin? Were there horses? And if the funeral was too simple, it became a topic for whispers. Shame haunted the ceremony. Sometimes families went into debt just to avoid this silent shame, because cheapness looked like a lack of love, like indifference, even if it was just a lack of money. The undertakers understood this psychology perfectly. Sometimes they didn't even have to convince. It was enough to show the options. One was modest, the other was dignified. and the silence in the room did everything by itself. Because no one wanted their mother, husband, or child to be buried like a beggar. Thus was born the most expensive mechanism of the system, the cell of the fear of social humiliation. But there was an even more terrible detail, because sometimes a cheap funeral was not a choice, but a compulsion. When debts exceeded the limit, when there was nothing to pay, the system became cold, and compassion disappeared completely. Because in the business of death there was a limit of patience, and when it was crossed, a person even lost the right to a dignified farewell.
When death became suspiciable. The system worked quietly, predictably, ritualistically, almost mechanically. People died, undertakers came, funerals were held. But sometimes, death began to behave strangely. Too sudden, too convenient. In areas where poverty already stifled life, sudden deaths were not uncommon. But some cases caused whispers. A young woman, healthy until a week ago. A child, no long-term illness. A man in the prime of his life. And always the same detail. The undertaker appeared too quickly, almost as if he had expected it. It was not proof, just a feeling. But Victorian towns lived by feelings as much as by facts. Neighbors noticed. She laughed yesterday. He didn't look sick. It all happened overnight. Words that didn't sound like accusations, but neither did they sound like peace. For when death comes without warning, the human mind searches for a reason. Sometimes the reason was found where previously only a craft had been seen, in the industry of death itself. Rumors crept in slowly, about undertakers who were friends with doctors, about strange coincidences, about the suspicious haste of burials. Newspapers touched on the subject cautiously, not directly, innuendo. Because death was a sensitive subject, and undertakers were a necessary profession. Nobody wanted panic, but panic was born of its own accord when the stories began to repeat themselves. Sudden deaths, quick contracts, hasty funerals. And somewhere in this chain arose a question that sounded dangerous even in thought. Was death always natural? Of course, most undertakers were ordinary craftsmen, professionals, people of the system. But any system has its weaknesses, and where death means money, there is always a temptation. Don't wait, but hurry. Sometimes all it took was one incident for trust to begin to crack. One story, one body, one funeral. And it was this kind of story that would soon shake the city, the funeral that would not leave peace. Real changes in history begin quietly, without fanfare, without warning, sometimes with a single funeral. Imagine a small church, gray morning, damp stones. The air is heavy with fog. The coffin stands in front, dark wood, neat work. Inside, a young woman. Sudden death. Officially, complications after a short illness. But something in this story did not add up. The neighbors remembered her laughter. Her friends, a ruddy face. She did not look sick. A phrase that was repeated too often. The undertaker behaved impeccably. A calm voice, clear movements, the perfect organization. Even too perfect. The procession is short. The ceremony is restrained. And yet, a strange sense of urgency remained, as if death did not tolerate delays. After the service,
People dispersed slowly. Whispers, looks, doubts without evidence. But doubts are the beginning of cracks. One man did not leave. A relative, not the closest, but attentive enough. His thoughts did not leave him. Too fast, too sudden, too smooth. He remembered the last meeting, her voice, her steps, her liveliness, and now the coffin. In Victorian Britain, trust in death was fragile. Doctors were wrong. Rumors outlived facts. And sometimes, families dared to do the unthinkable. Check, unofficially, quietly, without publicity. Because if the doubt turns out to be unfounded, it's a scandal. And if not, what happened next will turn an ordinary funeral into a story that the city cannot ignore. Because sometimes a coffin hides more than just death, but questions.
When the coffin is opened too early.
The decision was made in a whisper, without official statements, without witnesses, without permits. Because doubt rarely turns to rules, it turns to fear. Only a few hours have passed since the funeral. The earth has not yet had time to become heavy. The silence has not yet become final. Early evening, the cemetery is almost empty. The fog is low, as if space itself does not want to see what is happening here. Several men, a lantern, nervous movements. No one says anything, because even the thought seems blasphemous. They dig, slowly, carefully, almost guiltily. The shovel meets the tree, a dull thud, the coffin. A moment of stopping, because now there is no way back. The lid is opened. The light of the lantern trembles. And in that second the air changes, because inside it is not peace, not the neat silence of death, but something else. The position of the body, unnatural. The hands are not folded. The face is not carefree. The fabric is wrinkled. It did not look like a dream. It looked like a struggle. A chill runs through those present, because there are only two options, either a terrible mistake or a terrible truth. The news spreads faster than any procession. Newspapers, whispers, panic. The fear that already lived in society is now taking shape. Premature burial ceases to be a theory. It becomes history. And stories in Victorian Britain had the power to explode. People begin to ask questions that they previously feared. Was she really dead? Who was in a hurry? Why so quickly? And for the first time, the shadow falls not only on death, but on those who made a business of it. Because if the coffin was opened too soon, then perhaps it was closed too soon.
The city that stopped trusting death.
Scandals in the Victorian era didn't explode. They crept, slowly, inevitably, like a crack in glass. One incident, one coffin, and suddenly the whole city begins to look at death differently. The newspapers pick up the story, cautiously but greedily. The headlines become more alarming. Was she buried alive? The dangerous rush of the funeral? Mistakes? Or something more? People read and feel the chill. Because this fear already lived in every home, now it has been confirmed. They speak in whispers on the streets, in shops, in pubs, at church gates. The same questions. Can doctors be trusted? Can undertakers be trusted? And the scariest, is death really final? Funeral homes are the first to feel the change in atmosphere. The client's views are different. Less submission, more suspicion. Families are starting to insist. Wait another day. We want to be sure. Delays, doubts, nerves. For the death industry, this meant chaos, because the system was built on trust, and trust was starting to melt. Some doctors are reacting with irritation, panic, superstition, press exaggeration. But doubt has already taken root. New practices are emerging. Longer observation of the body, repeated checks, expectations. Death was no longer accepted instantly. It demanded confirmation. And for the first time in a long time, the death industry found itself under the pressure of public fear. The undertakers, who yesterday had been the embodiment of order, now aroused alarm. Too quick an arrival, too convincing a voice. Everything could seem suspicious. Because sometimes, one story is enough to make the profession sound different. And the shadow of that story falls much longer than the funeral lasts. A business that never disappears. Panic doesn't last forever. Cities have a strange ability to get used to even fear. Scandals gradually disappear from the pages. New stories replace old ones. And life, as is often the case, slowly returns to its rhythm. And death? It never left. And so do the undertakers. Because despite the suspicions, despite the fears, despite the alarming headlines, someone still had to bury the dead. The death industry didn't disappear. It adapted. More rules, more medical checks, more formalities. Death became more controlled. But its economy remained. Because rituals didn't become cheap. Because status didn't lose its importance. Because the fear of shame has not gone away. The Victorian era left behind more than a fashion for black. It created a model in which death became a service, organized, structured, paid. And this model survived the 19th century. Today's funeral homes look different. Bright offices, soft lighting, cautious words. But the essence remains familiar. Packages of services, options, decisions in moments of weakness. Because death still comes when people are least capable of cold thinking. And the question that sounded in Victorian London has not lost its power. How much does a decent farewell cost? But the most disturbing question of history is another. Not about undertakers, not about doctors, but about us. How does society behave when even death becomes a market? When grief has a price tag? When memory is sold in variants? Victorian Britain did not invent cynicism. It only made it systemic. And now, looking back, one question remains. Could you survive it? This is not a horror story. This is history.